Chapter 14. Has man a soul? Continued. It must now be provisionally assumed that it has been proven that the subjective mind is endowed with powers and circumscribed by limitations, which clearly differentiate it from the objective mind. For convenience of reference and facility of recollection, the following recapitulation is presented. 1. The subjective mind is constantly amenable to control by the power of suggestion. 2. It is incapable of independent reasoning by the processes of induction. 3. Its power to reason deductively from given premises to correct conclusions is practically perfect. 4. It is endowed with a perfect memory. 5. It is the seat of the emotions. 6. It possesses the power to move ponderable objects without physical contact. 7. It has the power to communicate and receive intelligence otherwise than through the recognized channels of the senses. 8. Its activity and power are inversely proportionate to the vigor and healthfulness of the physical organism. 9. It is endowed with the faculties of instinct and intuition, and, under certain conditions, with the power of intuitive cognition or perception of the laws of nature. It needs no argument or illustration to show that the objective mind has little in common with the subjective in any of the foregoing attributes, powers, and limitations. The objective mind 1. Is manifestly not controllable by the power of suggestion in the sense in which the subjective mind is so controlled, that is, against reason, experience, and the evidence of the senses. 2. It is capable of inductive reasoning. 3. Its power of deductive reasoning is by no means perfect, nor does it approach perfection. 4. Its memory, in its best estate, is very defective, and, comparatively speaking, amounts to nothing more than an uncertain, evanescent ability to recall a few of the more prominent ideas and impressions which it has once experienced. 5. It is absolutely destitute of emotion. 6. It cannot exercise the slightest kinetic force beyond the range of physical contact. 7. It is destitute of any power remotely akin to telepathy. 8. The essential prerequisite to the successful exercise of its highest powers and functions is a perfectly sound, healthy, normal physical organism. 9. It is endowed with no power which is remotely akin to instinct or intuition. I submit that the mental characteristics of no two individuals ever presented a more violent contrast than exists between the objective and subjective minds of the human entity in all their essential powers, functions, and limitations. I might claim the logical right to rest my case at this point, for it must be remembered that I have thus far sought not to prove the immortality of the soul, but to demonstrate the fact that man has a soul. In other words, I have merely sought to prove that which I have for convenience designated the subjective mind is in reality the mind of a distinct entity, and not merely one set or series of faculties which perform their functions under one condition of the body, whilst another set of faculties perform their functions under other bodily conditions. I say I might claim the logical right to rest my case here, for I submit that the bare statement of the facts which differentiate the two minds constitutes prima facie evidence that they belong to two distinct entities. The onus probandi, therefore, rests with those who hold the materialistic hypothesis that man is a soulless being, possessing no attributes or powers that cannot be accounted for by reference to cerebral anatomy and physiology. I do not, however, intend to stop here, but will now proceed to show that there is no way of rationally accounting for the facts other than to predicate the actual existence in mankind of an entity which, in the vocabulary of spiritual philosophy, is denominated the soul. The nature of the question, broadly speaking, admits of but two hypotheses. One is that the facts presuppose the existence of two separate and distinct minds, belonging to two separate or separable entities, and the other is that there is but one mind having two distinct planes of consciousness, or two sets of faculties. One or the other of these hypotheses is the true one. They cannot both be true, and yet, for the purpose of demonstrating the immortality of the soul, it is a matter of indifference which of the two is adopted, whether we consider man as having two distinct minds, or as having one mind which manifests certain attributes and powers under certain conditions, and other attributes and powers under certain other conditions, provided only that the crucial fact remains that certain of those powers and functions do not pertain to this life. In other words, it is a matter of indifference whether we employ the words dual mind, or two minds, or two sets of faculties, for the same logical result follows. Whatever terminology may be employed in the discussion of the broad and pregnant fact that two sets of faculties exist in man, each possessing independent powers, functions, and limitations. Facts are independent of hypotheses. Facts are primordial. Hypothesis is an instrument of logic for the scientific investigation of facts. Hypotheses, considered in their relations to each other, are divisible into two classes, namely, concurrent and antagonistic. Concurrent hypotheses are those of which the ultimate conclusions coincide. Antagonistic hypotheses are those of which the ultimate conclusions are variant. It is often a matter of indifference which of two concurrent hypotheses is the correct one, and it is often impossible to ascertain with certainty which is scientifically correct. It is, however, generally ascertained, sooner or later, by the failure of one to explain facts collateral to the main question, but resident within its purview. When that occurs, the true scientist will immediately resort to the other, providing that one explains all the facts. 3. The hypotheses of duality of mind on the one hand, and of unitary mind with two sets of faculties on the other, are illustrations of concurrent hypotheses. Inasmuch as their ultimate conclusions regarding a future life are identical, that is to say, they are each founded upon the one fact that man possesses subjective faculties that perform no normal function in physical life, and objective faculties which can perform no function in spiritual life. The conclusions are necessarily identical, namely, that faculties which perform no normal functions in this life must necessarily belong to a future life. Hence I have remarked, here and elsewhere, one that the dual theory is not a necessary premise to enable us to arrive at correct ultimate conclusions. That theory, however, will be constantly advanced, partly for the sake of clearness of statement, but principally because it is firmly believed to be scientifically correct. It must be borne in mind, however, that one mind with two sets of faculties is virtual duality, especially if it can be shown by reference to anatomy, as well as by experimental surgery, that there are actually existent two organs of mind. This I shall proceed to show in the succeeding chapter. In the meantime, the dual hypothesis certainly explains all the facts. That is to say, everything happens just as though man possessed a dual mind, and that is all that can be required of a working hypothesis. The spiritistic hypothesis as opposed to the telepathic is a fair example of antagonistic hypotheses, for the conclusions are variant, and so are the hypotheses. I speak of spiritism as an hypothesis, although it is hardly deserving of that designation, for it is, in fact, merely a short and easy method of avoiding, rather than promoting, a truly scientific investigation of the subject matter. But, such as it is an exceedingly convenient hypothesis, and, for the use of those who imagine that simplicity is a test of truth, it is admirably adapted. It is a summary way of disposing of an intricate problem, of avoiding a difficulty instead of investigating its cause. It should be constantly borne in mind that an hypothesis is not a final dogma. It is, as before remarked, merely an instrument of investigation. To establish it as a scientific truth, there are two prerequisites. 1. It must explain all the facts. 2. There must be no other hypothesis capable of explaining all the facts. When these conditions are present, then, and not till then, is an hypothesis elevated to the dignity of a scientific truth, an established principle, a theorem. I have made the foregoing remarks, at some risk of repetition, for the reason that I desire the reader to keep constantly in mind the fundamental principles of scientific investigation, and for the further reason that I desire him to measure the value of my arguments, past and future, by the highest known standards of scientific inquiry. We will now briefly consider the 9 propositions which set forth the salient characteristics of the subjective mind, and which seem to warrant us in postulating the dual mind hypothesis. The first in the order of statement as well as of importance relates to the law of suggestion. When that law was first discovered, its full import was not realized. As I have heretofore pointed out, it was discovered in the course of scientific experiments on hypnotic subjects, and it was, consequently, regarded as a law pertaining exclusively to experimental hypnotism. As long as the law was supposed to be confined to that narrow field of operation, the dual hypothesis was unnecessary. For most of the phenomena of experimental hypnotism could be accounted for on the theory that in the artificially induced hypnotic state the mind of the subject could be dominated by the suggestions of the hypnotist. But when it was discovered that the law of suggestion is the dominating principle which gives character and direction to all psychic phenomena, it was found that the single mind theory was inadequate. And this inadequacy became more marked when it was discovered that a psychic can control his own subjective manifestations by exercising the power now known and recognized in the scientific world as autosuggestion. When this power is fully realized, it will be found to be demonstrative of the dual hypothesis, in that it fully and easily explains all the facts, whereas the single mind theory is adequate to explain but very few, and the few that it can account for are of the least possible significance. As a single illustrative instance where the single mind theory fails, it may be remarked that it has again and again been demonstrated that, by persistent autosuggestion, the objective mind can control the subjective in direct contravention, not only to the beliefs, but to the positive knowledge of the former. Again, it is well known that, under the influence of suggestion, the subjective mind will not only assume control, but will act in direct opposition to the volition of the objective mind. An illustrative case has been brought to my attention as I write. A gentleman of this city had been induced to join a developing circle of spiritists who desired to establish a direct and independent line of communication with the other world. He very soon developed the power of automatic writing, and some very remarkable results ensued. As might have been expected, the power which moved his hand to write told him many things which he did not objectively know, and gave many remarkable exhibitions of power which constituted conclusive evidence to his mind of spirit identity and of the truth of the spiritistic hypothesis. But the remarkable feature of the case was that it soon began to assume a sort of dictatorship over his daily conduct, and on lines which he had least reason to anticipate. For instance, although he was not particularly devoted to music, yet his control insisted on being taken to concerts, oftentimes to his great inconvenience. When the control desired any indulgence, the gentleman was apprised of the fact by feeling a decided sensation in his right arm and hand, which sensation the gentleman soon learned to recognize as evincing a desire on the part of his control to communicate in writing. He often felt the impulse while walking the streets, and, upon being furnished a tablet and pencil, the control would direct him to go, perhaps to an adjoining street, to listen to a hand organ. Sometimes it would ask for indulgences which were decidedly out of harmony with the settled moral principles of the gentleman's life, and so persistent were the requests that he was finally obliged to refuse to allow any communication in writing except on condition that those subjects should be tabooed. Fortunately, the gentleman had not gone so far as to cease to desire to resist the subjective impulses, and he saw his danger in time to avoid its consequences. He had a superficial acquaintance with the law of suggestion and the theory of a subjective personality, but could not harmonize his experiences with that hypothesis. The control acted with perfect independence, he reasoned, and frequently in decided opposition to my wishes, that is, to the suggestions of my objective mind. How could that occur if the law of suggestion controls the subjective mind? The answer is easy and perfect. The first and ever dominant suggestion in his mind was that the control was a spirit from the other world. His whole environment, during the time of the development of the power of automatic writing, was such as to force that suggestion upon his mind. He was in a circle organized for the purpose of obtaining communications from spirits of the dead, and all the communications were received under that suggestion. The control, therefore, was assumed from the start to be an extraneous, independent, dominant, irresponsible power which the medium could in no wise control or direct. That was the primary suggestion under which the control acted, and it necessarily carried out that suggestion by acting the part assigned to it. Of course, the idea never occurred to the gentleman that the very fact that the so-called spirit insisted on being taken to a concert was demonstrative that the intelligence was his own, and was inseparable from his physical organism for the time being. If it had been a foreign spirit possessing the powers ascribed to such spirits, it would seem that it could have heard the concert without the necessity of making a draft upon the gentleman's purse or his time. Be this as it may, the very vocabulary of spiritistic circles conveys the suggestion that the communicating intelligence is in control of the medium. If it did not act accordingly, and assume the right to control the medium, often in opposition to subsequent suggestions, the law of suggestion would have no place in the science of experimental psychology. I have, of course, assumed that the control in this case was the gentleman's own subjective mind, and that the phenomena were produced in strict accordance with the laws which govern all subjective mental activity. Indeed, the phenomena are illustrative of those laws and principles in more than one sense of the word. As we have already seen, they illustrate one of the most subtle and intricate phases of the operation of the universal law of suggestion. They also incidentally illustrate a phase of subjective mental characteristics to which as yet little attention has been given by students of experimental psychology, namely, the power of music over the subjective mind. Some attention was given to it in my former work, one in Drive Aldred S. Warthen, Ph.D., M.D., of the Michigan University, has made some very interesting experiments as yet incomplete, however illustrative of some physiologic effects of music in hypnotized subjects, to which I have alluded in a former chapter. Chomet, a French author, has also written a work entitled Effects et influence de la musique sur la same et sur la maladie, and Vigna, in Italian, has given us Sul, Importanza Physiologica e Terapeutica della Musica. Little advance, however, has been made in the study of the physiological effects of music, although there is no doubt that the field offers rich results to the student who will give patient and intelligent attention to that line of experimental investigation. It will probably be found, however, that the physiologic effects are due to reflex action of the emotions upon the physical system and not to any direct vibratory action upon the nerves. It should therefore first be studied as a psychological problem. Music has been loosely described, by those who recognize its subjective origin, as a passion of the human soul. This is not scientifically correct. It may properly be described, however, as being at once the minister and interpreter of every emotion and every passion of the human soul. It is purely subjective, that is to say, all good music is a product of the subjective mind. It is true that the objective mind is capable of directing the muscles so as to play, and play correctly, an intricate piece of music. It is also true that a machine can be constructed upon which anyone who can turn a crank can correctly play the same piece of music. The sounds in the two cases are identical in character, hard, mechanical, soulless. It is only when the muscles have been trained to the point of automatism, to use the common phraseology, or, speaking with scientific precision, it is only when the subjective mind directs the movements of the fingers so perfectly that the objective mind can employ itself with other thoughts, that true music can be produced, the emotions of the musician's soul expressed, or the passions of the listener made to respond. Mechanical music, whether played by a man or a machine, can never inspire the human soul with emotions of love or of patriotism, or lead the warrior to face the cannon's mouth, unless, indeed, the hearer's subjective mind by its interpretive power supplies the missing stimulus. Even the diabolical sounds of a bagpipe, when that instrument is tortured by an inspired native, will move the soul of a Scotchman to a frenzy of patriotism. To say that the difference consists not in the instrument that is played, but in the manner in which it is played, would be a trite and commonplace observation. The true explanation possesses a far deeper significance. The difference between good and poor music, or rather between real music and its counterfeit, is determined by the source from which each emanates. Music has its origin in the subjective mind. It is the language of the soul and is expressive of its every passion and emotion. Like the song of the bird, it is the cry of love, longing, passion, hope. It may also be the wail of despondency and despair, if what the Latin poet tells us be true, dulcia defecta modulator carmina lingua, canader signus, funeris ipsi sui. In short, it is the most subtle medium provided by nature whereby soul can speak to soul, that language of the emotions which cannot, by a kindred soul, be misinterpreted. Its primary function is to give expression to those emotions which constitute the motive force in the perpetuation of the species. It is the language of love. Like every other faculty of the soul, it has its normal functions and its abnormal manifestations. It is, necessarily, as foreign to the objective mind as are the emotions to which it gives expression. But this is a digression. It has been indulged in partly for the reason that I desire, incidentally, to give to music its proper place in the classification of subjective phenomena, for I shall have more to say on the subject hereafter, and partly because it affords a striking illustration of the two-mind theory. Primarily, however, my object in citing the case was to give a fair illustration of the subtle and intricate workings of the law of suggestion, and to point out some of the sources of error against which it is necessary constantly to guard. In concluding this branch of the subject, it is only necessary to remark that it seems obvious, even at this stage of the argument, that whilst the two-mind theory certainly affords an ample explanation of all the facts of suggestion, the theory of a single mind is totally inadequate for the purpose unless we assume two sets of faculties, which amounts, practically, to duality. It is difficult, however, to argue a self-evident proposition, and one is sometimes compelled to draw attention to the absurdities involved in its opposite. In the question under consideration, for instance, the bare presentation of the facts of autosuggestion compels assent to the two-mind theory as a self-evident solution of the problem. And yet, for the present, assuming that a physical demonstration is impossible, it may not be unprofitable to draw the attention of the reader to the absurdities involved in the one-mind theory. To that end, let us state the essential proposition relating to the phenomena of autosuggestion which the one-mind theory necessarily presupposes to be true. It is this: one mind is able, by autosuggestion, to convince itself of the truth of a proposition which it knows to be false. It will at once be seen, not only that the proposition involves a palpable absurdity, but it also involves a positive contradiction in terms. Now, there is no rule of logic more manifestly and self-evidently valid than that a proposition involving a positive contradiction in terms is necessarily false. And yet, if we are to accept the one-mind theory as the true one, we must be prepared to accept as true a proposition which, by its very terms, is absolutely untrue. Nevertheless, in one sense of the word, it is true that an individual, mark the distinction, may, by autosuggestion, convince himself of the truth of a proposition which he knows to be false. But that is an absurdly loose and unscientific way of stating the proposition. Stated as follows, it is manifestly true. The objective mind of an individual may, by auto-suggestion 7, convince his subjective mind that a proposition is true, which proposition his objective mind knows to be false. The proposition, thus stated, will receive the instant assent of every alienist who has intelligently studied the facts of experimental psychology. He will at least agree that, considered as a working hypothesis for the systematic study of the problems of insanity, the dual mind theory is perfect. I submit that a perfect working hypothesis is necessarily a true one. The next proposition in the order of statement is that the subjective mind is incapable of independent reasoning by the processes of induction. This, as before stated, is a corollary of the law of suggestion, and much of what has been said will apply with equal force to this proposition. It is obvious that the dual hypothesis affords the only solution of the problem, for it is manifestly unthinkable that one mind can at once be capable and incapable of inductive reasoning. The third proposition, which relates to the power of the subjective mind to reason deductively from given premises to correct conclusions, may be dismissed with the statement that it is not set down as one of the powers which differentiate the two minds by antithesis. The difference is only in degree, but it is so enormous that it must be held to be cumulative evidence of duality. The same remarks apply with even greater force to the fourth proposition, which relates to the perfect memory of the subjective mind. Its prodigious positive power in that direction, when compared with the feeble efforts at recollection of the objective mind, has all the effect of contrast, and must be considered as an important factor in the problem of duality. It is certainly difficult to imagine one mind as being possessed of two sets, as it were, of faculties, with identical functions differing only in degree, whilst the more perfect of the two is observable only under abnormal conditions of the body. The fifth and sixth propositions, relating, respectively, to the emotional nature of the subjective mind, and to its power of moving ponderable objects without physical contact, have been sufficiently discussed already. The seventh and eighth propositions, relating, respectively, to telepathy and the abnormality of subjective activity, can be more appropriately discussed in forthcoming chapters. In the meantime, it can be truthfully said that the distinctive characteristics embraced in the four propositions last named present in themselves indubitable evidence of the truth of the dual hypothesis, and that there is no other rational way of accounting for all the varied phenomena which they represent. The ninth proposition will be discussed in a separate chapter.